My name is Greg Mulkey. I am a Christ follower recovering from alcoholism. I struggle with food addiction, but today I choose recovery. First, let's just open with prayer. Father God, we just want to thank you for this opportunity to gather together and to learn more about you and mostly ourselves. And we thank you for this program of Choose Recovery. And I just pray tonight that if there's one person that takes one nugget away, you have done your job. We thank you for loving us. Amen. First, I'd just like to thank Rochelle and the team here at Choose Recovery for inviting me out here to share my story tonight. And it is an honor when somebody asks you to come out and share your story. And I take that very seriously. So my sobriety date is April 7th of 2000. I have a home group with Alcoholics Anonymous. And it's a meat and potatoes. We meet every Wednesday night on Coronado, Cape Coral First United Methodist Church, 7:30 p.m. And that is a closed meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. I do have a sponsor. My sponsor has a sponsor, and he has a sponsor, and I sponsor people myself. There is genealogy in this because I've got a great grand sponsor. So to my story. I was born and raised in a regular family, southeastern Virginia. Both my parents worked, and we had everything we needed growing up, and maybe a few things we wanted. But there's one thing that we did not do together as a family, and that was go to church, ever. And the only time we were in a church setting was for a wedding or a funeral. So at a very, very young age, I experienced my first drunk. And we had gone to my cousin's wedding, and her younger brother, who was about 2 years older than me, invited me into a coat closet, was what it was. We don't have those down here. And he says, "Here, try this." And he had smuggled a bottle of champagne in there. So I tried it, and it tasted pretty good. It was the good stuff. I think nowadays it's like $6 a bottle. And, so we proceeded to finish off that bottle. And we went back out into the room, and my mother is a social drinker, about 4 or 5 glasses of wine per year. And she had a full glass of champagne sitting in front of her. And so I reached over and grabbed that glass and drank about half of it. And she didn't say anything because she was very open. She wanted us to experience the world and didn't want us to get thrown into something that's going to eat us up. And about 5 minutes later, I reached over and I polished off that glass. And then we left, and at the end of the evening, as I was walking out, I noticed somebody left a whole glass of that funny juice over on that table. So when we were all outside, I made an excuse to go back inside, and I polished off that glass of champagne. That was my first drunk. And 3 things happened to me that night. Number 1, I drank alcohol. I loved the way it made me feel. Number 2, I lied about how much I'd been drinking when I said, "Let me try that." And number 3, I went to any length, including lying to my family, to get more of it. I didn't know it at the time, but I was exhibiting alcoholic behavior, and I didn't realize it because I was only 10 years old. Now, I'm going to skip through the drunk-a-log. We all have a story. We've all got a past, and they all stink, and that's why we're here tonight. Amen? So, on April 7th of 2000, I was coming out of a liquor store with my 3rd half-gallon of whiskey for the day. And I got into my car, I put that bottle on the car seat, and I heard a voice that says, "You can't keep doing this." And I looked behind me to see who was crawled into my car, because I heard a voice. And I just looked at that bottle, and I just closed my eyes, and I said, "God help me." Well, 45 minutes later, I was arrested for my last DUI. That was the first and closest I ever came in my entire life to surrendering, admitting defeat, and asking for help. Now, I'm going to fill the gap from 1972 to 2000 in about 12 seconds here. I call this my resume, and this will paint a real good story for you. So my resume included a failed marriage, a lost relationship with my biological son, 2 lost houses, 4 lost very high-paying corporate jobs, 16 wrecked automobiles, 12 alcoholic arrests, and 7 were DUIs. So It was a mess. Okay. So I knew I was going to be going away for a while because this was my third DUI in 13 months, and I had not fulfilled my first 2 court obligations, the last 2. And incidentally, my attorney, who had met with me shortly after that, shares my last name, and he says, Greg, he said, you've got to do something about this. And I said, yeah, I know. I'll just try a little harder this time. And he just shook his head like, this poor slob doesn't understand what I'm telling him. So in a very short while after that, I was moved into what I call a gated community. And that is where I resided for the next 16 and a half months. But that's where God introduced me to 2 of the most influential men in my life. Brother K, as I refer to him, his name was Frederick Cos Jr., and he told me that many times because he told me to look him up when I got out. And he was walking down the hallway one day doing some jail ministry, and he stopped at my cell, and he looks and he says, how you doing? And I said, well, I'm in here and you're out there. Why don't you figure it out? And he just smiled, and he says, would you like to talk about it? I said, you got a while? He said, I've got all day long. So I sat up on my bunk, and I said, well, I'm here because of my drinking, and I guess it started when I was 10 years old. And I told him, and later I realized as I look back, I was telling myself my story. And it's what I call a lifeline. And you got highs and lows, and every low included alcohol. So after I finished sharing with him, he says, you never have to feel this way again. I said, I don't. And he said, no, you can turn your life over to Jesus right now. In that jail cell, on my knees with another man, I accepted Jesus as my Lord and Savior. Now, for the stupid idiot I was, I had to do step 3 first before I could go to step 1 and do it properly. You see, my first AA meeting was in 1988, 12 years earlier. But Brother K came back. He brought me a Bible. He brought me a daily bread. He brought me a couple of books. And he got me started on a spiritual journey, which I still continue to do 2 of the 4 things today, 20 years later. Now, as I begin to think with a little clarity, thinking back to 1988 and those in between, I remembered that alcohol was the reason I was here. And it took me back to the days of when I went to my first meetings. And I knew those guys were always happy. I thought it was a fake. I thought it was a front and everything. And I kind of thought I wanted what they wanted. Well, now I made a decision. I needed what they wanted. And I did need it. But now I made a decision. I want what those guys had. I began requesting AA meetings to the community where I was living. And their answer was always the same. We need volunteers. And I was so naive, I would write back and say, could you tell them I'm serious this time? I really mean it. I thought there was only a handful of them running around doing that stuff. So little did I know, a few weeks later, there was an announcement over to PA, AA meeting in the gym, 5 minutes. And I'm like, oh my gosh. And that's when I realized that God could and would answer prayer. I met 3 men that night. It was Bruce, Fish, and Jim. What a gang they were. And after, they came back every single week, including Christmas Eve and Christmas Day when I said they wouldn't. And so on Christmas Eve, I said, do you guys get paid extra to come in? And Bruce just sitting here like this, says, we don't get paid to do this. And I said, why do you do it? I still didn't get it. And he said, this is how we stay sober. So I was still seeing those guys for several more months, and they really laid the foundation to get me off and started correctly. So I let him know when I was going to be released. He said, pick up the phone book. That's back when we had, for some of you, they're a big book about this thick. You can't put a bullet through them, and they're filled with phone numbers. He says, call Alcoholics Anonymous, tell them where you are, and they'll tell you where the nearest meeting is. My first night out, I was at my first voluntary AA meeting. So, you see, my sister, while I was there, she was writing me, and that was one of the highlights of my days, getting mail. And she was telling me about this church. She had moved down to Florida about 10 years earlier, and she was telling me about this church has a Puerto Rican pastor, and he's in recovery from alcohol and drugs, and they've got this Christ-centered 12-step recovery program. I'm like, that sounds like a pretty messed up place. And I says, maybe I'll go. They might let me in. So I had plans to move down here. My first full day in Cape Coral, I walked through the front doors of Grace Church, Cape Coral campus, and I've been involved over there ever since. I realized when I walked in that night, I was home, because reading the Bible and reading the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, the 12 steps, I saw how they went together. And I walked in, and at the end of the night, I'm like, wait a minute, they stole my idea. And then I realized, no, they've just done all the legwork for me. I get to enjoy it now. I was also introduced that night to a very good man who would go on to become my first sponsor. He also became, through sponsorship, the big brother I never had, my best friend. He helped me start my first business. We were fishing buddies. And it was during that time that I realized how people really mean it when they say, anything you need, let me know. Because he was the epitome of that. You remember John. Well, I've told you what it was like. I drank. Lots of bad things happened. I told you what happened. I surrendered to God, asked for help, and He put the right people in my life. So now I'm going to explain what I do today to maintain what has been taught to me and how I have maintained my sobriety. One night in 2002, it was about the middle of the year, I was at my home group meeting, and my sponsor was there, and my grand sponsor was there. And my grand sponsor must have sensed something was kind of gnawing at me. And so the chairs were set up in a circle, and he just kind of leaned forward and he says, Greg, he said, all you have to do is go to meetings, work the steps, use your sponsor, get involved in service, and trust God with the results. And I looked over at him, I said, that's all there is to it. And he says, if you do that, you will begin to look at life differently. My grand sponsor died with 42 years of sobriety. When he walked into a room, it lit up. You know something good was going to be said if he opened his mouth. And I took that to heart. I said, look at life differently. That's amazing. So what I refer to as the 5 non-negotiables, well then, Choose Recovery went and stole those from me. All my good ideas get stolen from me. But those are what I consider the non-negotiable, the 12-step recovery. Number 1, go to meetings. And my first sponsor was taking me to about 6 or 7 meetings a week, and we were taking Wednesday nights off. That's because it was his date night. I'm like, well, I want to take Saturdays off. No, you're taking Wednesday off. But we were going to lots of meetings, and a recovery meeting is where we all understand we're all the same, and we're all trying to go in the same direction, but we need each other. He also had me pick a home group. And a home group is a group you make a commitment to be there every week. And then you begin serving in that group. So that's where I got started, there and Grace Church. My service got started off real fast and went real far. So the next one is use your sponsor. And a sponsor is somebody who has been down the road before you. And it's sort of like if they walk through a field of landmines, and you trying to go through the same field, they can tell you, follow my footsteps. I made it across. If you follow my steps, you will too. So one night, he told me, he says, all right, he says, call me tomorrow. I said, okay, no problem. Well, tomorrow came and went, and I said, well, I'm going to see him tonight. He's going to pick me up to go to a meeting. And I get in the truck, and he said, you didn't call me today. And I'm like, well, I knew I was going to see you tonight. And he says, I told you to call me today, and you didn't call me. He says, when I asked you, what were you willing to do for me to be your sponsor and to maintain your sobriety, you said anything. I said, you're right, I did. And he says, then call me every day. What I realized was sometimes we're going to be put in a position to do things that we are not comfortable with. But this is part of the process. And you have to trust the process. So, where am I? Oh, I'm on this page. So this is where we started working the steps together. He took me through several fourth and fifth steps. He was my sponsor for quite a while. He also helped me start my first business. He sort of was like a big brother to me and took me under his wing and got me started on this journey like I could have never done by myself. So on the other end of having a sponsor, I understand now what it's like to be a good sponsor. And I also believe it when I hear it said that if you do not have a sponsor, you should not be sponsoring other people. Because there are going to be times that we don't have all the answers. And we're going to need to rely upline somewhere. So, and sponsees will throw you a curveball quite often. So the next one, number 3, is work the steps. Now, as with anything, if you want to succeed, you're going to have to practice at it. And that's going through the steps constantly. And my current sponsor put it to me like this several years ago. And he says, your recovery is like a knife. You have to keep it razor sharp. And if that knife is not sharp and you go to slice a tomato with it, you're just going to squash it and make a big mess. He said, but if you are razor sharp, you're going to get nice paper thin slices out of it. And it's going to be beautiful and everybody's going to want some of it. I'm like, that makes sense. So razor sharp is a good thing. That's kind of why I chose my current home group, because we go through the 12 steps and the 12 traditions out of, the AA literature. And in a year, we go through the 12 steps 3 times and all the traditions once. That's like 3 step studies a year. That's pretty awesome. Pretty easy for 1 hour a week. Now, as far as my first step, the most important thing I learned was the better I clean house, the more room I make for God to work in me. The number 4 is get involved in service. Any of you all that know me around here, you know I'm a service freak. You ask me to do something, I'm going to say yes. And it's what my first sponsor taught me, a reasonable act of service. You're not asking me to, come over and cut a tree down and make firewood for you. You're asking me to show up and make coffee a little early. That's a reasonable act of service. There's not a position in the Choose Recovery program that I have not served in for a good amount of time. I've done them all. Now, when I'm serving, sometimes what that means is I've got to show up a little bit early. When I have to make coffee or set the room up or maybe stay late to help clean up. But that is a time that we're with other people, shoulder to shoulder. Some of the best friends I've made were washing dishes, elbow to elbow, over at Grace Church on Friday nights. When you're setting up with the new guys, that's one of the first opportunities of service. I always show up early and just hang out with them. And that's where I have met some of the closest friends I have today. And it's serving God shoulder to shoulder. So, when I got released out of prison, I made a promise to God. And I made sure I was on the right side of the fence before I did all this. And I looked back at that building and I made a promise to God. And I said, if you can get me back in here, as if God's limited, if you can get me back in here to carry the same message of hope to somebody that was delivered to me, I will go. Now, I was walking out a convicted felon. I said, that's a safe bet. Well, don't try to challenge God. 3 years later, I was asked to join the corrections committee with Alcoholics Anonymous. I said, what's that? We take meetings in the Lee County Jail. I said, they won't let me in. And they finally kept throwing the application. I said, I'll fill it out as a joke. About 3 or 4 weeks later, I get this letter in the mail from the Lee County Sheriff's Office. And I didn't answer it. I didn't open it because of fear. Fear is our number one offender. And I was afraid it was going to say, we're sorry, we don't want you in here. But it told me to come down and get my badge. And I said, how did this happen? And God spoke to me again. He says, you made me a promise. And I'm like, oh. I did that for 3 years. And 3 years later, in 2006, I was asked to join the Kairos prison ministry. And that's where we go in and spend 72 hours with Men in Blue, sharing the love of Jesus with them, their families, and those that watch after them. And that's where I really love to go. I've been serving there for the last 14 years, with the exception of some time I committed to Choose Recovery. And if there's one ministry I could keep out of all of them, besides my recovery, it would be Kairos Prison Ministry. And the last thing I learned from my grand sponsor that night was trust God with the results. Trust God with the results. I've learned that it's okay to make plans as long as you don't plan the outcome. And when I do, I'm usually setting myself up for something lesser. God's plan for each and every one of us in this room tonight is more than we could ever imagine. If I would have written a script for my life 19 years ago when I got off the Greyhound bus with nothing but a suitcase and a duffel bag and no driver's license, if I'd have written a script out, I would have sold myself short, tremendously short. For the first 37 years of my life, I couldn't imagine a relationship with God. Today, I wouldn't imagine my life without a relationship with God. I keep my bucket full by starting my day off with devotions, and I don't pray daily. I pray all day long. And I've heard it said best is when God wakes you up in the morning, say, thank you, God. Now what can I do for you today? Today, I am definitely not half the man I'd like to be, but I am more assuredly twice the man I used to be. And as I mentioned before, 12-step recovery is a process. You have to trust the process. The most important thing I've learned, trust the process. Do what you're not comfortable with. My name is Greg Mulkey. I'm a Christ follower recovering from alcoholism. Thank you for letting me share.
Thank you, Greg Mulkey. Oh my God. Every time I hear his story, it's better and better. I am powerless over drugs, alcohol, codependency. My name is Arlene, and today I choose recovery. Hello, friends. Let's all stand for a moment, and as we thank Greg, whether you're online, and of course us here in person, let's, at the count of 3, just say, we love you, Greg. 1, 2, 3. We love you, Greg. And we do love you, Greg. You know, we're going to play a song here. In fact, you guys can start plinking a little bit if you want to. You know, as Greg was talking, I couldn't help but go to Mark chapter 9, you know, in the Bible. You know, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, 4 books of the Bible that tell the story of Jesus and the life of Jesus and his disciples. And in Mark 9, there's a story of a father who had a son who had a demon in him. And the demon continued to make the son hurt himself. And I'll bet that demon and the pain that was inflicted by that demon probably is a lot like the pain that we've had in our addiction. Can you say yeah? It can feel like a demon. And that father didn't know what to do. Didn't know what to do for that child. And Jesus came, and the father said, if you can you do something? And Jesus said, if I can. With me, all things are possible. And the father said, oh, I believe that, but can you please help my unbelief? Because it's like that, isn't it? Like we believe that God can do it, but then there's this little piece that says, well, he's never done it before. Right? So why should he do it now? when you turn your life over to the care of God, He can do anything in your life. He can do anything. Nothing is impossible with God. Even if you have a little bit of unbelief, it doesn't matter. He overcomes that. You know, tonight we're going to maybe turn the lights down a little bit. No? Okay, maybe we're not going to turn the lights down a little bit. Pretend the lights are down a little bit, all right? And I want to invite you guys to the altar. What part inside of you says, yeah, that's great for Greg, and that's great for Arlene, and that's great for Emily, and that's great for Rochelle, and that's great for Kip, and that's great for Tom, and that's great for everybody. But is that going to happen for me? Is God going to do that for me? And if there's that little bit of unbelief, I want to invite you to come to the altar tonight. There's some spaces. You can social distance apart. I invite you to come to the altar and ask God to take away your unbelief and to work in your life and to remind you again and again and again that He's here, He's for you, He's fighting your battles for you. You don't have to do it, He's doing it for you. All you have to do is to surrender to Him. If you got battles in your life you don't think you can overcome, He's fighting them. And this is how we do it. We do it on our knees. We do it in front of God. We do it, and God comes and He just fights that battle for us. So I invite you to come, pray. Turn it all over to Him. Allow Him to fight that battle for you. Don't be afraid. Don't feel dumb. Just come on and come. You know, this is a place where we encounter God in a special way.